I'll go ahead and start it now, just so we don't forget.
And I understood that Alessia might have a slide that she want to present. She was not sure if she would do that, but we'll see. So I can make a co-host as well when she arrives. There's Mumbi. Hello, Mumbi.
Hi, Lars.
Hi, how are you? Good to have you here.
Hi, Mumbi.
Hi, Sophie. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
And hi, Franz, Charlie.
All right, Lars, I'll be here in the background, but just shoot me a message if you need anything.
Okay, thanks.
And Lars, I might recommend recording on your end because for some reason the office Wi-Fi seems to be a little bit unstable, which is
Okay. Okay.
Just as backup.
By the way, we had a little over 30 people who registered, so which is good. And I see them still coming in, so we'll wait a minute or two, and then we'll start. It was kind of the same with the first session, right? That people arrived actually until 10 minutes after the session started, so it will work out.
No sign of Alessia yet, I see.
No, not yet. I did have email correspondence with her only, I think, 15 minutes ago.
Okay.
So, yeah. That will be, that will turn up just right, I guess. So what I suggest, I admit them all to the session and then we'll start, okay?
I think we should, yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
I suggest we'll give it to 16:05 CET and then we'll start. So just 1 minute, and I'm sure that a couple of other people will still arrive. We have a little over 30 people participating in the session, so I expect them to come in pretty soon.
And I see that Alessia has joined us now as well.
Yes.
So,
Hi, Alessia.
yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. And a warm welcome again to everyone on behalf of Frans Melissen and myself. For the people that have not participated in the first webinar, I'm Lars Moratis, and together with Frans, we are the holders of the Chair in Management Education for Sustainability, which is a joint initiative of Antwerp Management School and Breda University of Applied Sciences. And great to see that you're joining us today for this second session in the PRME Education Academy seminar series. So as you know, one of the main objectives of the series is to get inspired by cutting edge and thought-provoking scholarly and practitioner insights on responsible management education. And we aim to do so well, based on a variety of perspectives. And for this, we will be giving the floor to several renowned scholars and fellow academics who will share their ideas and results of their work. And today we'll be on the topic of activism within and by the business school and university. And especially since this may be somewhat of a controversial topic. And honestly, I should say, I cannot help but wonder why it is a controversial topic, although others are probably opposed to the idea. You're invited to participate in the discussion, of course, in the final part of the session. So please don't hesitate to ask questions to the speakers or referents and challenge them by taking a provocative stance towards their ideas and contentions, for which I should emphasize you should use the chat function.
Obviously, we are happy to have some great speakers and reference on today's webinar that, as Lars said, carries the title Unexpected Activism, a Crisis of Climate. We have the pleasure of having Charlie Gardner as today's speaker, while Mumbi, Maria Wachira and Alessia Contu will take their role as reference. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Charlie, as I hope you will notice later on, is an outspoken interdisciplinary conservation scientist, a writer, and an environmental activist, active with Extinction Rebellion. Currently, he is an associate senior lecturer at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology, which actually ominously abbreviates as DICE, of the University of Kent. From his bio, we read that his research and writing focuses on adapting conservation to the climate emergency, the role of scientists in advocacy and activism, the researcher practitioner divide in conservation, community-based approaches to conservation, protected areas, and anything to do with Madagascar and its wildlife. Also, he has co-authored the important and thought-provoking article From Publications to Public Action, the role of universities in facilitating academic advocacy and activism in the climate and ecological emergency. Charlie, we are honored to have you on today's session. Today's reference are Mumbi Maria Wachira and Alessia Contu. Mumbi is a full-time accounting lecturer in Strathmore University Business School in Kenya. And her research focuses on the intersections between accounting practice, society, and the environment. And she's also an active member of the UN PRME Chapter Africa. Alessia is a professor of management at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she specializes in organizational theory, ethical and social dilemmas in management, and psychoanalysis, among other topics. She's the author of many articles on these topics, but one in particular catches the eye today, the one on answering the crisis with intellectual activism, making a difference as business school scholars, which was published in Human Relations. So Charlie, Mumbi, and Alessia, welcome. Great to have you with us today. As for the flow of the session, Charlie will start with his presentation. And when he has finished, we will give Mumbi and Alessia the floor for a brief reflection and some questions to Charlie. And then after that, we open the floor to questions from anyone attending today. So with that said, Charlie, the digital floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Frans and Lars, for your kind introductions and for inviting me to participate and share what I have to say with you today. It's a great honor for me to be here. I'll start with one apology for the state of my webcam. It's very low resolution, unfortunately, so apologies for that. A second apology, I am very unfamiliar with the world of management education. I am a conservation scientist. I've been concerned since I was very young with the destruction of the natural world. Over recent years, I've become increasingly concerned also with climate change. So I've transitioned. My concern for the natural world led me to become an academic. I felt that if we have global problems, then the first step to addressing those problems is knowledge. We must understand them. So I became a scientist. Over more recent years, it's become increasingly apparent to me that knowledge alone has not been sufficient to bring about the changes we need in our societies and economies faced with the destruction of our world and climate change. So I've started thinking a lot about this relationship between academia, which is a space where we generate and share knowledge, and decision-making, because ultimately it's decision-making at governmental levels and institutional levels, which is our only hope from emerging from these crises. So what I want to talk to you about today is the role of academia, and specifically academics, including management educators in this crisis. So I'll start with a bit of a recap about the crisis we're facing. I know many of us will be familiar to some extent, but we might not be aware of the full implications. So it's important that we start on the same page, and I'd like to make the case that we are in a planetary emergency, and in an emergency we must take emergency action. So having made the case that we're in an emergency, I want to explore this relationship between knowledge and decision-making and make the case that our assumed paths of change, our assumed theories of change from research and education to governmental decision-making is not working. And I will propose a potential solution to that, which is activism, non-violent civil disobedience. And then at the end, I just want to spend the last few minutes speaking specifically about the role of management educators, educating the managers of tomorrow. Because managers are in charge of institutions. And as well as change from the top, as well as governmental change, we need our institutions to adapt and lead the change in this crisis. So I want to talk about the role of management education from a very naive perspective at the end. So we are in a climate emergency. Already, we have reached an average of 1.2 degrees over temperatures before the start of the Industrial Revolution. And already just at 1.2 degrees, we are seeing incredible, mind-blowing extreme weather events. So in 2021, for example, 10 countries set their national temperature record. We had the hottest temperature ever recorded on planet Earth. And in June 2021, it reached 49.6 degrees in Canada. This is further north than Antwerp, and yet it reached 50 degrees. It's not just temperature. In Italy, in October, there was 74 centimeters of rain in 12 hours. So I can't even show it on my screen how big 74 centimeters of rain is in 12 hours. In Antarctica, 3 months ago, it was 50 degrees hotter than normal. This red line here is not indicating where the data point is. The red line is the data point. It was 50 degrees hotter than normal. Climate models did not predict this. Climate models could not predict this. If the climate models had predicted this, the modelers would of course have said, this model is broken. We must recalibrate it. So, you know, it's progressing worse than what the science is predicting. And of course, this is very expensive. So in the USA, last year, there were 20 separate extreme weather events that each cost at least $1 billion. Some of them cost $20 billion in damages. And of course, so we have the data for economic damages that this extreme weather is causing in places like the USA. We do not have the data for the suffering and death and economic damages it is causing in places like Kenya. So all this, remember, is happening at 1.2 degrees already. Our governments have decided that a safe level of planetary heating is 1.5 degrees, which of course is hugely blind and disrespectful to the people already dying at 1.2 degrees. Nevertheless, regardless of what our governments have determined is safe, we're not going to hit that because their targets are not backed up by actual policy changes that will allow them to meet their targets. The journal Nature carried out a survey of climate scientists last year. Over 60% of climate scientists think we will hit at least 3 degrees by the end of this century. Of course, there are people already born today that will be alive at the end of this century. My nephews and nieces will all being well, they'll be alive at this time. We cannot predict what a 3-degree world will look like. To some extent, we can predict what the weather will be like. To some extent, we can predict, we can estimate, we can model how agro ecosystems will develop. To some extent, we can model how wildlife and ecosystems, the natural world, will adapt to this. But we cannot predict how human societies will react to this. We cannot even predict if the next government in any country is going to be more reactionary or more progressive. How can we react? How can we predict how the combined decisions of global society is going to be in a 3-degree world? We have no idea. What we do know is that it's a lot bigger than just extreme weather. Mary Robinson, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. It's the biggest threat wildlife will face this century. It's the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. It's the greatest security threat of the 21st century. It's the single greatest threat to sustainable development. And it's the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. As a conservation scientist, as someone concerned with the conservation of the natural world, climate change really, really terrifies me because its impacts on the natural world will be catastrophic. So, of course, we've heard about the disappearance of the sea ice, how there will be no sea ice in the Arctic in the summer, and this will, of course, have devastating impacts on polar bears and walruses and everything else. But this is not the only vulnerable ecosystem. So coral reefs, for example, coral reefs have been called the rainforests of the sea because they're so full of life. Half of all life in the oceans is around the coral reefs. But reefs are vulnerable to warming waters. When the water is too warm, they bleach and they die. This coral bleaching was a completely unknown phenomenon in the scientific literature until the 1970s. Today, it is so prevalent that half of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia is dead. Dead. And of course, this isn't just about pretty fishes and corals. 500 million people in tropical areas rely on fish as their primary source of protein. This is a humanitarian disaster in the making. Until recently, ecologists weren't very worried about forests, but now we are seeing how vulnerable forests are to drying and to fire. Of course, we've all seen on our news screens how Australia and California and much of the dry forests and rainforests in South America have been burning. But it is not only tropical forests. The taiga, the pine forests of Russia, of Siberia, are burning. In 2020, there were 21 million hectares of Siberia were burnt. This is not supposed to happen. This is the sign of a world gone wrong. So, of course, it's not just other species and natural ecosystems that have a specific set of conditions in which they can survive. Human beings also can only survive in certain conditions. And specifically, we cannot survive in places that have a mean annual temperature above 29 degrees. At the moment, places with a mean annual temperature above 29 degrees are limited to a few areas in the Sahara and the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Let me give you a little warning about what I'm about to show you. Because under a high emissions scenario, so if we continue emitting as we have been and continue to grow our emissions, then by 2070, in 48 years' time, places that are uninhabitable to human beings will have expanded to cover places that are currently home to 3 billion people. Much of the northern half of Latin America, North Africa, the Horn of Africa, Northwest Madagascar, which is where I lived for 10 years, the Arabian Peninsula, most of India, all of Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, New Guinea. These places will be uninhabitable to people. This map just shows places where we can't survive because of temperature. It says nothing about where we can grow our crops. It shows nothing about sea level rise. And we know that many of the world's great cities will have to be relocated because of rising sea levels. So what we are talking about is the complete reorganization of human activity on this planet within decades. This is the challenge ahead of us. Not just, so of course, this is a projection. This is not certain to happen. This is what will happen if we continue to burn fossil fuels. Of course, we can stop. This can be avoided. But regardless of which path we take, we have incredible challenges ahead of us. We have a huge challenge to transition away from fossil fuels and mitigate this, stop this from happening. But we also have a huge adaptation challenge. The world has to adapt to the changes that are now inevitable. The big concern is that organized human society will be unable to cope with the magnitude of these changes. So this is Professor Will Stephan, who's an Earth system scientist at the Australian National University. When talking about our growth-based economies, he says, it is becoming abundantly clear that one, this system is incompatible with a well-functioning Earth system at the planetary level. Two, this system is eroding human and societal well-being, even in the wealthiest countries. And three, collapse is the most likely outcome of the present trajectory of the current system. And this last part is worth repeating because he does not say that collapse is one potential outcome. He says it is the most likely outcome of our present trajectory. In other words, all we have to do to bring about the collapse of organized human society is continue as we are doing now. It's really difficult to imagine a functioning organized civilization in a 3-degree world. And there are different mechanisms by which collapse could be brought about. The most likely is global food shortages. So all of civilizations have evolved in the last 10, 12,000 years, which has been a period of remarkable climatic stability called the Holocene. We need climatic stability to have agriculture to produce a food surplus. You need to be able to predict when it's going to rain and when it's going to freeze. You need agriculture to have a food surplus, and it's the food surplus that allows the division of labor, that allows some of us to become philosophers and some of us to become scientists and some of us to become management educators. Without agriculture, there can be no civilization. And it's thought that if we had simultaneous agricultural failure in 2 or 3 of the world's major bread baskets at the same time, then this would lead to global food shortages, civil unrest, and collapse. Food productivity is already on the decline for many crops because of climate change. Wheat production in Canada was down 30 or 40% last year. In the UK, potatoes were down something like 30% the year before. The bad weather is a problem. The threat of collapse is now so real that there is a growing branch of the social sciences called collapsology. This is what we're trying to avoid. Of course, I've only talked about climate change so far. We are also destroying the natural world. We're seeing the destruction of forests and wetlands and other habitats. We are over-harvesting some species. We are introducing invasive species to other places. We are systematically polluting. We're polluting the world, not just with waste products like plastics and chemicals and things, but we are systematically, deliberately poisoning our agricultural land. We are trying to exterminate all the insects, despite our knowledge of how important they are. And then on top of that, we have climate change and the related phenomenon of ocean acidification, which we don't need to worry about for today. But so we face these twin challenges. We're heating the atmosphere and we're destroying the natural world. And these are two sides of the same coin. They're both they're driven by the same things, economic growth and consumption, but they're highly interdependent. We cannot protect the natural world without addressing climate change, because climate change threatens the natural world. But we cannot address climate change without protecting the natural world, because the natural world stores lots of carbon. It absorbs lots of the carbon that we emit through burning fossil fuels. So we need to protect nature. We need to stop burning fossil fuels. So severe is the threat. Yeah, I talked about this being a threat to human civilization. It's a threat to our existence. That's what they mean when they say it's an existential threat. So severe is this threat that in 2020, over 11,000 scientists signed this paper saying that the Earth is facing a climate emergency. And so this word emergency, it's lost a bit of its power recently. You know, everybody's talking about it. Lots of city councils and universities, they declare emergency and then they do nothing. But this word was very well chosen. It was specifically chosen. They did not call it a climate crisis or a climate problem, but a climate emergency, because an emergency does not only describe the situation, it implies a response. In an emergency, we take emergency action. So everyone agrees it's an emergency. The UK government has declared a climate emergency. And in this planetary emergency, we look primarily to our governments, because it's our governments that set the rules of the game that the rest of us must all play by as individuals and as institutions. And as well as setting the rules, the governments also help set the economic incentive structures that determine the directions that the rest of the economy is going to go in, both through negative incentives, taxation, and positive incentives, subsidies. So governments are really the key stakeholders in this planetary emergency. And yet, despite their words, they are not acting as if it's an emergency. They are doing the precise opposite, in fact. So this is Dr. Fatih Birol, who is the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. The International Energy Agency is not Extinction Rebellion. It's a conservative advisory body to governments. On energy policy, it is conservative. And yet they said, if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas, and coal from now, from this year. And that was last year. So this is the advice that governments have received. And they are talking the talk. They have set decarbonization targets. But we must not judge them by their words. We must judge them by their actions. And when we look at their actions, it is clear that they are lying when they say they are taking action. So all of these headlines are from since the end of 2021. In November 2021, the world's governments met in Glasgow for COP26, the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the 26th time they had met to discuss reducing emissions. Joe Biden talked about how his administration will not abandon the young people of the world. 3 days later, his administration held the largest sale of oil and gas permits in US history. The United Kingdom holds the presidency of COP26, and it markets itself as a global climate leader. The United Kingdom has licensed or intends to license over 40 new fossil fuel projects in the UK and in the North Sea. It's quite stunning to see the extent to which governments have chosen to promote a fossil fuel based future. We cannot reach any other conclusion. in full awareness of the consequences, they have chosen the path that will lead to the destruction of everything. They have chosen genocide. So that's what individual countries, governments are doing. What about governments globally? So I talked about COP26. We have a global piece of legislation, the UNFCCC. It came into being in 1992. So this graph shows the slope of this graph is the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The colors show temperature. So each bar is 1 year. Blue bars were colder than the average, red bars are hotter than the average. And we have indicated certain key dates in global climate science and global climate negotiations. What we can see is that whilst governments have been meeting for only over 30 years, while the science has been clear for over 40 years, the more governments meet to discuss the problem, the hotter it gets and the more atmospheric concentrations rise. So we need to ask ourselves, why has this global negotiation process been such a failure? Well, COP26 was very instructive in this regard. So at the end of every COP, the parties publish a text that they have all agreed. This is what we discussed during this meeting. This is what we have agreed. In COP26, the text mentioned coal. It was the first time any fossil fuel has ever been mentioned in the text, but only coal. Oil and gas were not mentioned. So we know that fossil fuels are responsible for 82% of our emissions, and yet for 25 years, governments negotiated addressing climate change without mentioning the cause of 82% of emissions. This is like spending 25 years on a global strategy to address COVID-19 without mentioning viruses. It's completely nonsensical, utterly crazy. So how could this be? Well, at COP26, the largest delegation belongs to the fossil fuel industry. There were over 500 professional lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry, more than any other country. Of course, the existence of the fossil fuel industry is completely dependent on governmental inaction on climate change. It really is fossil fuel industry versus the world when it comes to climate change. But yet, when those that have a vested interest in preventing action have the largest seat at the negotiating table, then of course, we do not get the required action. So it's an emergency. We know it's an emergency. We also know that what we are doing is not working. We are on the path to disaster. Our governments are leading us to disaster, and all civil society's efforts so far have not been sufficient to lead us away from this. So we have to ask ourselves, we're academics, we're researchers and educators. It's an emergency. We have to take emergency action. How should researchers and educators react in this emergency? Well, I thought about this a bit, and I think in academia, we have two theories of change about how we think knowledge and education will lead to a better world. And I think many of us, we become academics because we want to make the world better. We want to contribute to public goods. And as a scientist, I think scientists in particular, we think that our job is to generate information. If we generate information, our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions in the public good. Also, we can achieve change by sharing our information with the public. If we share our information with the public will force our leaders to take the required action. Unfortunately, both of these theories of change are spectacularly naive, because governments don't listen to academics. They are driven by an economic growth imperative. They respond to corporate lobbyists, and to a lesser extent, they also. To give you an idea of the scale of corporate influence, in 2020, the oil and gas sector spent $136 million in political contributions and $110 million on lobbying. That's $250 million in just one country, in just 1 year, in an attempt to subvert democratic process and influence political decision-making. This money is not given to governments out of generosity. It is given to secure favorable political decision-making. It's an investment on their part. And it leads to what George Mumbi has called the pollution paradox. Essentially, the dirtier an industry, the more that industry has to spend on political lobbying to avoid being regulated out of existence. Good industries don't need to spend their money on politicians. What that means is, that the net effect of that is that governments end up governing for and being governed by the very dirtiest industries. And it results in state capture. The apparatus of the state have been captured by corporate interests. In my field, so climate change is a perfect example of how science has not led to policy change. But we see this as well in my field of conservation science. Here is a headline from 2 months ago, 3 months ago now. The UK overrules scientific advice by lifting a ban on the bee-harming pesticide. So why are we doing science? Why are we doing research if it doesn't lead, if it doesn't influence decision-making? What's the point of doing this research showing that this product is dangerous if the government will allow the product anyway because of political funding, because of money, because of political corruption? Let's call it what it is, corruption. So our second theory of change is that if academics share our knowledge with the public will force our leaders to take the required action. But again, with climate change, we do not see this because the public is misinformed. For 40 years, the fossil fuel industry have been investing, for 30 years, they've been investing in a huge misinformation campaign. First, they tried to persuade us that climate change was not happening. Then they tried to persuade us that it's not because of greenhouse gases. Now they've given up on that. They can't pretend that anymore. Now they're focusing on delay. Now they're telling us all the reasons why, yes, it's happening, but it's not important and we don't need to take action. So to this day, huge numbers of people think that this is not a serious crisis and we do not need to take action. Those people are victims of a huge misinformation campaign by the fossil fuel industry. But on top of this, on top of the misinformation, there's a lack of information. The media simply do not cover climate change as the emergency that it is. When we have a heat wave, the newspapers will illustrate it with pictures of children eating ice cream and frolicking in fountains. They celebrate it. They don't link it to climate change, and they don't show pictures of people dying in their homes and the fields of wheat getting baked in the countryside. And specifically, they don't link it to climate change. So in 2021, the word cake was mentioned 10 times more on TV in the United Kingdom than climate change. I like cake. Cake's good. But this is the greatest issue there has ever been. And this is very, very dangerous. This lack of information. And as a result, people, the general public, do not know how bad this is. Many of you in this room, I am sure, are shocked by some of the things I have told you. How can we act in an emergency if we don't even know it's an emergency? So when we think about this, it becomes clear to me that academic activities, research and teaching alone cannot trigger the transformative change required at the speed required. Teaching is hampered by the time frame involved in the pathway to action. We are teaching young people today, it will be 15, 20 years before they are in leadership positions. That's too slow for an emergency. It's necessary, we need to teach them, but it will not result in the emergency action we need today. But I'm focusing particularly on research, and we know that, all of the science we have produced saying how bad this is has not led to the change we need. And that's because it ignores the processes that most powerfully influence political and policy change. We provide information instead of money. That nobody wants information, they want money. But it does not address the forces that are so heavily invested in maintaining the status quo. It's easy to think that everybody wants action on the climate, but that's not true. Not everybody wants action on the climate. A lot of people are very wealthy and very powerful from the way the world is now, and they don't want the world to change. They are invested in preventing change. Many of us already know this, and that's why in our private lives, we do more. We write letters to our MPs and we sign petitions, and sometimes if things get very, very desperate, we will go on a sanctioned march from A to B. However, we have been doing all of these things for decades as well, and they haven't worked either. So we need to rethink a little bit, how are we going to bring about the changes we need? Clearly, we're not just going to sit back and watch everything be destroyed. So what are we going to do? When we look at, as academics, we are evidence-based practitioners. And when we look at the evidence of history, we see that many of the most progressive social changes of the 20th century came about through non-violent civil disobedience or civil resistance. The suffragettes won votes for women by creating trouble. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King won civil rights for people of color in the USA. Mohandas Gandhi used non-violence to help trigger a revolt that would lead to independence from empire. The gay rights movement in the 1980s used civil disobedience to win civil rights for LGBTQ plus people and to win investment on the AIDS pandemic, which was being ignored. So it's hugely, hugely powerful. And it works by bringing neglected issues into the public spotlight, making the media cover them, and by shining the light on these issues, they gain public sympathy and public support, and that leads to change. Nobody was talking about segregation on buses in the south of the USA. This was not an issue that was on the news until Rosa Parks refused to move from her seat. That put the issue on the agenda. Today we see civil disobedience is on the rise again, and it has been flowering, blossoming since 2018. And this time it is in support of life on Earth. famously in 2018, one young woman started skipping school to protest outside the Swedish parliament, and Greta inspired a movement that would see millions of young people taking to the streets simultaneously. In the UK, we saw the rise of Extinction Rebellion, which has spread globally, and there are movements all over the world. These movements have been hugely successful in changing the conversation on climate. The reason everybody is talking about climate change now is because protest movements have successfully put it on the agenda. On the top left here, we see how it has influenced the public. So there is a direct impact of Extinction Rebellion protests on public concern for the environment. And the mechanism is clear. When there are protests, the news covers it. It is not possible to talk about climate change protests without talking about climate change. And when they hear about it, people get scared. In January this year, the environment became the #1 concern for people in the UK. Above COVID, above Brexit, above the economy, above the NHS, above all of it, the environment is what people care about now. And this is having an impact in political and media discourse. So 3 days after the first big Extinction Rebellion protest, the UK Parliament became the first major economy to declare a climate emergency. On the bottom right, this is an image from before our last general election. We had a leaders' climate debate on primetime TV. This has never happened before. And this is the front page of a right-wing newspaper in the UK. Join our Green Britain Revolution. Of course, they continue to carry a pro-growth editorial line inside, and this is all just words. None of it has been followed by action, but it shows the power of these movements. To me, the fact that they have achieved only words but not action means we need more of them. More such civil disobedience. So in 2019, I attended the first Extinction Rebellion events in London. And I was speaking to lots of people there. And I met lawyers, and I met doctors, and I met grandparents, and I met young people, but I didn't meet any academics. I didn't meet any scientists or other academics. And it struck me as very, very strange that this should be the case. What? So I wrote this. I wrote an editorial that was published in a high-profile journal, Nature, Ecology, and Evolution, essentially saying that scientists have tried every acceptable channel to try and influence political decision-making. None of it has worked. Therefore, we need to join forces with these popular civil disobedient movements pushing for change. And I was surprised that it was published in such a high-profile action, because I'm calling for illegal action. I'm calling on people to break the law. But not only was it published, it was a bit of a sensation online. There's a metric called Altmetric, which measures all the online activity around a paper. Within a week of this paper being published, it became one of the top 800 most shared scientific papers since they started measuring, out of 15 million. So, and that said to me that a lot of people were waiting for someone to say something like this. Of course, the idea that academics should become politically active is not a new one. This man at the top here is perhaps the most famous climate scientist of all. This is James Hansen, who famously gave his testimony to US Congress in 1988, which first brought climate change to public attention. He's been arrested multiple times blocking fossil fuel infrastructure. Carl Sagan, the legendary physicist, was arrested multiple times blocking nuclear test sites. So this, scientific activism has a long history. And more recently, lots of scientists have been endorsing action by others. So over 1,000 scientists signed an open letter endorsing the actions of Extinction Rebellion. In 2019, 12,000 scientists signed a letter endorsing the youth strikes. And I find this makes me feel very strange. The youth strikes are acts of civil disobedience by children. And I think it is wonderful that academics endorse the actions that children are taking. But I think it's horribly wrong that we are leaving it to the children to show leadership. That is a dereliction of our duties. And I think academics have to be not just supporting these movements, but leading them. And I think it's important that we do. There's a number of reasons why this is so. One is academics are some of the most trusted and respected members of society, and that makes us powerful messengers. Social psychology research shows that part of the power of a message comes not from the message itself, but who the messenger is. So when we have academics and lawyers and doctors visibly taking part in these movements, it's very powerful, because our governments and our media try to dismiss these movements. They say, these people are just unemployed hippies. They're not like you. Don't listen to them. They're not respectable. So our participation counters that. Of course, academics have access to platforms. Because you have a university affiliation, or you have, some fancy letters before or after your name, it means that people want to hear what you have to say. People put a microphone in front of my face because I have doctor in front of my name. Rightly or wrongly, that gives me a certain power, and with that comes a responsibility to use that. For me, the most important thing is that we need to act like it's an emergency. The scientific community, the academic community, has been telling us for a long time that everything needs to change. And yet, we don't lead the change ourselves. If I was to tell you now that I can smell smoke coming from that door behind me, and I think my house is on fire, and yet I carried on giving this talk, of course you would not believe me. You would call out my bullshit, because I'm not acting as if what I'm saying is true. And this is the same as what the academic community is doing. When we publish our papers on the need for change, and then just sit back at our desks and write another grant proposal, or fly off to a conference on the other side of the world, we send a very clear signal that we do not even believe our own words that this is urgent. And lastly, I feel a sense of moral obligation. When I see young people taking to the streets, I know that they are there because of what the academic community has told them. It is the results of science and research that has taken them out to the streets. So I feel we need to join them. I'm very sorry, I just realized how late it is. I'm speaking far too slowly, so I'm going to hurry up a little bit now so we have time for questions. My apologies. Nevertheless, many academics think that it is wrong of academics to get involved in political questions. They say the job of academics is to produce information and to be detached, neutral observers. Our job is to provide information but we must not speak about how that information should be used. Well, when we examine this, actually, this idea comes from the Middle Ages, when research was carried out by monks and academia was housed in monasteries. So knowledge came directly from God. And to be able to receive the word of God, the monks needed to be pure, empty vessels, completely detached from the material world. And yet this is a social norm that still guides academia. We are not in the Middle Ages anymore. Times change, and we're in an emergency. I also find this idea of value-free or politically neutral science very strange, because many sciences are not value-free or politically neutral. Medical science is all about values. It has a specific purpose to promote public health and human health. My field, conservation, has a specific objective to conserve biodiversity. So when I make a statement such as, we must end deforestation, that is not simply a scientific statement. It is explicitly a political statement. As a conservationist, I am already an advocate. It's intrinsic to what I do. And the shift from advocacy to activism is not a shift in neutrality, it's just a change in tactics and strategy. Others worry that engagement in advocacy might hurt their credibility, but actually experimental psychology research shows that this is not the case also. So I believe very strongly in the role of academics in leading these changes. However, many of us are institutionally hampered by the institutions we work in. So we feel universities and higher education institutions have a particular role to play in facilitating advocacy and activism by academics. And we wrote this opinion paper, which was published in Frontiers in Sustainability last year, From Publications to Public Actions. We suggested that many academics do participate in activism, but they do so as individuals. They don't do so specifically as academics because they might fear negative impacts on their careers. They might feel social stigma from their colleagues. And importantly, they might just be too busy. As academics, we are all too busy. Every professor reached the top by single-minded focus on the things that would help them reach the top. And I think, many of my colleagues, for example, they know that this is important. They want to take part, but they're just too busy. And they cannot justify spending time on something which does not lead to a publication or a grant or their teaching. So we argue that universities must actively work to remove these barriers. And one way they should do that is by explicitly recognizing advocacy as part of the work mandate and altering work allocation models and hiring and promotion policies as a result. Universities state, if you look at the mission statement of any university, it will state they want to contribute to the public good. We've already seen how research is not enough to do this. I explained how teaching is too slow in an emergency. So the way we can achieve change is public communication and public actions. I think, one part is not just allowing staff to do this, but training them to be more effective at doing this. And another thing we talked about in our paper is the need to reform curricula to focus on the need for civic engagement. And this is something I want to come back to later when we're talking about management education. We also talked about how universities must defend the rights of academics to push back on emerging threats to academic freedom, because this is something that's on the rise all over the world. So I'm going to skip this, actually. I was just going to introduce my organization, Scientist Rebellion. just very briefly, we believe in the power of academics to catalyze change in broader society. So we take public actions. At COP26 last year, I was part of a group of scientists that we blocked a bridge with chains around our necks, and we in order to get arrested, and 21 of us were arrested. It was the first mass arrest of scientists over the climate crisis, and because of that, it got huge media attention. You do not see a mass arrest of scientists every day. It's a crazy thing to happen. Why would scientists do this? And it forces people to think. Just in April, 2 months ago, we had our second global rebellion. Over 1,000 activists took part in over 28 countries. This is our Spanish group throwing fake blood across the steps of Parliament in Madrid. I'm going to skip this, but if you want to talk about how to get involved in activism, we can come back to that. In fact, I'm not going to skip it. I'm just going to say, if you support these things, not everyone in the Air Force is a pilot, and not everyone in these movements is gluing themselves to a bridge. There are plenty of other ways we can support, publicly or anonymously. And, you know, academics have a lot of skills in abundance that are very useful to these movements. So please don't let fear of breaking the law hold you back. There are plenty of other ways to support. Just finally, I want to talk a little bit about change within our institutions. And I think this is perhaps most relevant to you as management educators. I've focused a lot on the role of governments, and I focused a lot on how our role as individuals is to pressure governments for change. I don't believe, you know, most of the climate action we hear about is focused on individuals. Stop flying, change your bank, turn the lights off. The power of individuals is limited because the world we live in is decided at the governmental level. But there is a third level between individuals and government, and that is our institutions. Private sector, public sector, informal, all our institutions and organizations have to adapt to a changing world. And I think managers have a critical role to play in catalyzing these changes. So regardless of climate change, the world is changing very, very fast. And our technology is evolving. So every institution has to adapt to these changes. The institutions that succeed and thrive in the future are the institutions that move first and adapt quickly. And remember that these changes are not just about adapting to climate change. It's about adapting to new technologies and new worlds. You know, 100 years ago, we shifted very rapidly from horses to motor cars. There were some institutions then that resisted these changes. There were probably delivery companies then that said, no, I've invested a lot in horses. I have big stables. I'm not going to change to motor cars. What do you think happens to those companies? So this is the important thing we need to think about. And this is the thing I would say to you as management educators, is that every institution in the world has to change, but it has to change not because of climate change, but because the world around it is changing. Managers do not have a duty, except for a moral duty. Managers have a moral duty to address climate change, but their contractual duty is to promote and grow their institution. So we need to make the business case for change. If I go and speak to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Kent about the need to decarbonize, I will not even mention climate change, because her job is not to care about climate change. Her job is to promote the University of Kent. So I will only speak to her about the fact that students want to go to decarbonized universities. That is the business case for that institution. There are additional business cases about financial savings on energy and things, but you know, we need to find the right messages for our audiences, and I think as management educators, you have an important role to play here. Managers, the managers that help their institutions thrive in the future are managers who will be anticipatory and proactive, not reactive ones. So I think it's important to ask ourselves, to what extent, so everybody, no matter if you caused the problem, contributed to the problem or not, we all have a responsibility to fix it. And the change has to come from every level, individuals, institutions, government. So we need to ask ourselves how, not just how can our institutions adapt to a changing world, but how can our institutions help drive the change? How can our institutions contribute beyond their formal mandate? And one particular important question as educators, and not just management educators, all educators, given the pace of the changes the world is undergoing, are we educating our students for the changing world of today and tomorrow, or are we still preparing them for a world that no longer exists? If we are still preparing them for the world that no longer exists, then we are failing them. So yeah, sorry if that was a bit brutal, but this is an emergency, and in an emergency, the normal norms don't apply. And I've stopped. I no longer pussyfoot about the issue. So I hope this has been an interesting stimulation, at least, and I very much look forward to hearing your provocative agreements or rebuttals, as Lars suggested. And once more, I apologize for going late, but please feel free to contact me by email or Twitter beyond this session. I'd be happy to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charlie, and no problem about taking a bit more time. And thank you also for telling it like it is, I think. And just one minor detail, I think I saw some of the photos that you used in your presentation were taken by your wife, which is a professional photographer, I understand. So just as also kind of an endorsement. We have two referents for this session, and one is Mumbi and one is Alessia. And I think it was the order of in which they were presented. It was Mumbi. So I would like to ask Mumbi to share her reflection on what Charlie has said first, and after Mumbi has finished, I'd like to ask Alessia to share hers.
Okay, thank you, Lars. I hope I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, Charlie, thank you for that very inspirational, emotive presentation. And as you were speaking, it is, I felt as if I have this roar from inside my soul that just wants to get out of my body. I think the first thing that has stood out is what I know too well, that overwhelming sense of urgency. The way I usually talk about it to people is I feel it is like the Matrix, for those who have watched that movie. You realize that you are, there is a matrix and reality isn't what you thought it was. So you can no longer look back. And that's what kind of, it reminded me of that feeling that I had. I'm still quite surprised that even until very recently, just a few weeks ago, we still have a senior banker from the HSBC talking about climate change and the comments being made there of being unsubstantiated and shrill. And now coming into my context, which is Kenya, and I'll also make it broad because it is really Africa. You see that map that you showed of uninhabitable regions, that one really hit me because I know it, but then seeing it like that makes me then wonder, okay, so where are my nieces going to live? Yeah. The complexity for us here is sometimes that, and I hear that from my students, because one of the things I also teach is sustainable finance. And I find that the first 2-3 classes are converting people first, because the question on people's mind is, how are we going to develop this place? How do we push economic growth? It is still very traditional. It is still a lot about industrialization. That's the conversation people are having. So first I have to convert them. But the complexity is, you know, we didn't cause a lot of this problem. That's the place where we start saying, okay, where is the justice then? We've not caused it, we're experiencing it though. And you're right in saying that it is our collective responsibility. So we need to take action. But we also need to understand that the ecological well-being of our region is highly intertwined with our own social well-being. And I think we have understood this and we know this, but for the local person, we may not call it climate change. And that, I think, is where, as educators, for us here, I saw there were some people, I think also from South Africa on this call, is we need to drill down that information from the high level to a kind of very local level understanding. There's a friend of mine who we work closely with on this, and we train SMEs on issues to do with sustainable development and rethinking their business model. And he went on the street asking people, do you know what the SDGs are? And I was, flabbergasted by the responses. But it's really the challenge, because it means we are actually not getting the information to every last person in a way that can be understood, and then in a way that can make them see that sense of urgency. The other thing, because I know we're running short of time and I do want to welcome Alessia, is the role of academia, management educators. We cannot sit back in the publishing space forever and just feel comfortable there. Here in Strathmore, I remember we used to do an SME roundtable, and the president would come every year. And the SMEs would come and ask him very hard questions, the business environment, why is it like this? What are the incentives you're giving us? Very difficult questions, and he had to answer them. But he came because we have the legitimacy as an institution and the so-called neutrality, even though we should not be neutral in this issue. So I think we need to kind of, and I see it now more with my colleagues here, that we've understood, or we're slowly starting to understand, that we can't just remain in the classroom forever. The final thing I'd like to say, and that is from the accounting point of view, because that is my training, is I'm happy to see more academics in management understanding this. Recently, the University of Bristol wrote an open letter to the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they were telling that because sustainability reporting standards are being developed, and they told them, look, you need to tell us about double materiality, that an entity can only survive if it actually, if the planet and society is okay. And I thought, this is so obvious. But then when you talk to other accountants, the CPAs here, they're like, what? So it's really that we have a lot of work to do. And I can talk about this forever, but those are the observations I had. And thank you once again for your great presentation, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Mumbi, for your valuable reflection. And as you said, I'd like to pass on the word directly to Alessia for her reflection.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you so much, Mumbi. Thank you so much, Charles. Thank you so much to Lars and Franz for inviting me, and for all of you who are here participating to this event. Charles, that was an amazing presentation. I have you know, as Mumbi said, it was passionate, heartfelt, and wonderfully argued. So I only have 5 minutes, and and your presentation provoked a lot of thought. But since I have only 5 minutes, I'm just going to sort of try to be as succinct as I can in my comments. So the only thing, so I agree with everything that you said, and I completely endorse your call to activism, also in the specific ways in which you do so. The only thing that I want to add to your conversation and the way you put it is that, to me, you kind of let us academics off the hook far too quickly. You were far too gentle, if you like, with your assessment and in your argument. So fundamentally, my point is that academia, the university, academic work is not, as you pointed out, something external that happened in a neutral place, the ivory tower of academia. I have a slide that, Charles, do you mind to, not Charles, Lars, do you mind to share it so you can see it? So academia is, if you like, at the center, is the kind of circle that encompasses the 3 points that are part of the government, part of citizenship, and part of institutions. So academia actively participate in making every day these 3 things that we call institution, citizenship, and government, right? So this notion, the very notion that we keep on, and then a lot of people are very much invested in, which is what you said, this notion that academia is somewhat a neutral space, that we are all objective, going about our businesses, doing our research, without, in a kind of a value-free world and so on, is empirically wrong, as you yourself pointed out. And of course, actually, even the history of the coming to being of the university is very much an history of activism. So in the Middle Ages, the university was created exactly as a university out of the monasteries into being something, a new institution. And that itself was due to the activism of the students and of faculty. So already in itself, the institution is born out of the activism of all of those who were part of it. So literally it is inscribed in the very being of the university that it always encompasses activism, understood obviously in this kind of etymological root of being active, of being always involved in actions, right? So university, academia, management, knowledge, and practice are always involved in what we do in our academic praxis, right? So my, sort of point is that fundamentally the responsibility that you're calling for, the kind of moral responsibility that you're calling for, is far more radical. Why? Because our academic praxis, we're always already either supporting or transforming the kind of world we live in a multiplicity of ways. So, for example, we are management academics, right? So, Mumbi talked about, she's an accounting academic, so finance, accounting, management is all, we're all in the business schools, right? So it's not that the research is ignored by government, but it's what kind of research is actually actively supported by government. And you were, of course, very, soft in the way you said, this system is all based on, a specific way of economic and social development and so on, but that economic and social development, which is capitalism. And when you actually map out the differentiation in, with your really nice graph, right? Look from the 1970s, how it changed. So what is one of the things that changed there? Is the kind of development we had, this completely capitalism on steroids that was developed, supported by very specific types of economic theories. They were literally part of what government's decisions were, and literally, the revolving door is a classic, ways of talking about how the capture that you're discussing, right? So all of that does not mean that academics somewhat, are ignored, or they ignore the forces and so on. It's quite the opposite. A lot of them are quite nicely supported and participate and paid handsomely, actually, in promoting specific type of a socioeconomic development, which is called negative externalities in this case. So this climate emergency that we are all, you so beautifully and tragically presented is very much supported by very clear and very direct theories that completely, for example, ignore the responsibility of all of us, and each one of us has in reproducing that kind of system, including our work as academics, as management educators. If we keep on teaching those kind of theories to our managers and our leaders, this is what we are going to continue to see. So fundamentally, it's not that, we have to somewhat develop a kind of, transformation on the road to Damascus. We are always already either supporting or countering this status quo completely every day with every action we do and every action we do not do. So my call is absolutely, yes, activism in the way Charles so beautifully presented, but also really the consideration that we always already radically responsible for our action every day in our teaching. Our teaching is not an application of the rules. We make decisions every day in the way we teach, in what we teach, in the curricular choices we make, in the type of pedagogical choices we make. So what kind of choices are we making? Our universities, who's giving the monies to our university? How is our university investing the funds? How is the endowment invested? And so on and so forth. All of those things are things that we can have a say, and we do have a say every day, because saying nothing already is an action, as we know, of course, from pragmatism and all that branch of linguistics, right? So fundamentally, there is a very, and my colleagues already mentioned this, there is a lot of work that has been done really exactly to sort of explain all of this and making clear some of the both the theories and the tactics, as Charles suggested. I like to call it intellectual activism, simply because, to be honest, Charles, there is right now in management academia, but more broadly, a huge change in the way academia is understood. So, for example, there is a huge call to having a societal impact, right? Let me give you an example. Again, this is a business school issue, so probably that's why you're not familiar with it. So a lot of business schools are accredited by the ASCSB, okay? And the ASCSB has just changed its criteria to include societal impact, okay? Positive societal impact. So you see, this is a massive shift. Why? Because it's literally calling us exactly to that kind of institutional change in the procedures through which our work is evaluated, the performance established, and so on, right? Because we all want to be accredited. Why? Because we get the students through accreditation. So that is very, very important. But if that process, does not take into the account those radical responsibilities, which actually evaluate and constantly engage in that kind of wise decision-making that you were talking about, which is the phronetic rationality. It's not just the epistemic rationality that tells us all these rules and principles and so on, because that's not how people make decisions. People make decisions through phronetic rationality, and therefore it is our responsibility as educators, as university academics, to constantly think about how, what does that mean? How do we live our life? What does it mean to be living a good life that is for the flourishing of all, human and non-human creatures on this planet, right? So these are the questions we're facing. This is what all of us are called to do. And in business academia, there is an organization which I want to mention because, I think is important, because it's not like people haven't been doing their work. There are a lot of people doing their work. And one of the organization is called the Organization Studies for the Future, which is in that slides. And I invite each and one of you to go and see the Organization Studies for the Future work, the kind of work that they are doing, which is directly addressing the environmental challenge, the climate emergency, both in terms of thinking about adaptation, mitigation, in our work with a number of tactics, including, for example, endorsing them, as well as Charles said, there are a lot of activities people can do. You don't have to chain yourself to, a pole, even if actually some of them have already been arrested, like my colleague, Giuseppe Del Mestre, right? So just, so I shout out to the work that has been done and the kind of theories and ideas, specifically the intellectual activism ideas that I'm talking about, come from the tradition of Black feminism in the United States, and especially in conjunction with transnational feminist and socially and eco-socialist, ideals. So please go and have a look. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I talked for more than 5 minutes. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Mumbi. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Alessia. Thanks very much also for making the heartfelt argument that we should not let ourselves off the hook easily, and at the same time that we should appreciate what is being done for sure. Just looking for Frans, if we should end this session here, because it is 5:30 actually, of that you have a question.
Well, maybe one question to Charlie. Given that you've just been accused for being too soft and too gentle for us, maybe some final words from you on that topic before we let Lars close this session.
Thank you. Alessia, I just cannot wait to hear the recording of this, because I'm just going to listen to your bit on a loop for a couple of hours, I think. Mumbi, I apologize that my talk was really directed at academics within high emitting countries. So obviously the context in Kenya is very different. Kenya has a different challenge of having to economically develop whilst trying to avoid doing so in a fossil-based way. And of course, that highlights a second responsibility of the governments of the high-emitting countries. Our countries not only have to transition ourselves, but we have to financially support the transition of people in the most affected areas and places who have done so little to cause the problem. And of course, this, because of the pace of technology, this presents huge opportunities. Very few people in Kenya ever had a home phone. They went directly from no phones to mobile phones. And we could do the same with energy technologies. People could go, we don't have to transition from no electricity to fossil electricity. We can transition directly from no electricity to renewables electricity without the fossil stage. However, it is imperative that that transition is financed by those who grew rich off their own fossil fuel basis. So I don't call myself an activist for climate action. I call myself an activist for climate justice. And that includes not just support, but reparations too. In terms of final words, I don't know. This has been a very stimulating discussion. I don't know. I think the important thing is for us all to contemplate what this emergency means for us as individuals, as heads of our families, as professionals, as educators, as members of other institutions. If you're in a sports club or whatever, you know, we all have influence in various ways. And this is an emergency. It's difficult to, one of the things that is difficult with acting in an emergency is setting aside our personal ambitions. We are all professionals, we are all academics. We have achieved a lot to get to the position where we are now. We have achieved this because we were professionally ambitious. And it is difficult to set aside our professional ambitions. We've spent our lives trying to become famous professors or whatever. And it's difficult to set that aside. But yeah, there are no professorships on a dead planet. And we have to adjust our ambitions accordingly. So thank you very much. And thank you, Lars and Frans.
Thanks very much, Charlie, for these final words, and also thanks to Mumbi and Alessia for their reflections as referents today. Much appreciated. So let me end this session by just saying thank you to all the participants, and that we have a third and final session in this seminar series that will take place on, I just have a look, June 24th, which indeed is a Friday. And for that session, we have invited Martin Parker, also famous for his work on what he called bulldozing the business school, as our speaker on the topic of alternatives for rebuilding management education. So we hope to see you then, perhaps again. Thanks all, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.